This is J. Stephen Roberts of Real Crusades History. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about Portugal's involvement in the Second Crusade. And of course that means I'll be talking about the Siege of Lisbon of 1147. Now, as a lot of you may know, the Second Crusade, which took place pretty much right smack in the middle of the 12th century, was sort of a time when all of Latin Christendom went on crusade. It was roughly 50 years after the great success of the First Crusade. A major disaster had finally taken place in the Latin East with the fall of the important city of Edessa, and Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential man of the period, was in fact at the head of the PR campaign to launch the Second Crusade, and his preaching and his endorsement really spread enthusiasm for this large-scale campaign. Now, of course, the catalyst for the Second Crusade was events in the Latin East. So the movement of the French and German armies to the Holy Land was kind of the main show of the crusade, if you will. However, the Pope also endorsed crusading in two other theaters, the Baltic and in Iberia. Now, at this point, the popes had already endorsed and promoted wars in Iberia against the Muslims. However, after the First Crusade, the popes began to issue these official bulls of crusade for the Iberian Peninsula. And usually whenever a major crusade was called, such as the Second Crusade, the popes would suggest that Iberian Christians should refrain from traveling to the Holy Land and instead focus their crusading efforts on their own territories, since they were fighting the Muslims right there on their southern border. Around the period of the Second Crusade, Afonso I of Portugal was establishing Portugal as an independent kingdom. It had been a county prior to that, but by 1139, through his efforts and his martial valor, Afonso I had solidified Portugal as its own kingdom. By the time the Second Crusade rolls around, in 1147, it's a good opportunity because Afonso is ready to take on the greatest project of his reign, and that is the conquest of the great city of Lisbon, which was a very important Muslim city in Al-Andalus, and its acquirement would greatly increase the prestige and wealth of his new kingdom of Portugal. Now, Afonso I was a king of incredible energy and valor. Most of his career was spent waging war against the Moors, and he was incredibly successful at it. In March of 1147, Afonso captures the city of Santarém, north of Lisbon, and then he begins the Siege of Lisbon proper. He was assisted by the arrival of some German, English, Flemish, and Norman crusaders on their way to the Holy Land for the Second Crusade. He offered them to join his effort, and he promised to let them share in the booty of Lisbon. And these crusaders agreed. And this is a common theme we will see throughout the history of the Crusades in Spain, is that there will be Latin Christians from other parts of Christendom who will aid the Iberians in their efforts. So, to kind of look at this event more closely, I would like to read to you an excerpt from a chronicle written by a man who was almost certainly an eyewitness to the Siege of Lisbon. But finally, when we had been besieging the city for 6 weeks, and it had been learned that the enemy were rather hard pressed by hunger, while an untold abundance of bread and wine and fruits was at the hand of our forces, they gradually plucked up their spirits. They drew the ships up on dry land, lowered the masts, and put the cordage under the hatches, as a sign that they were spending the winter. But the men of Cologne 5 times began to dig mines for the purpose of overturning the wall, and were as many times overwhelmed. Hence our forces again had cause for deep discouragement, and murmuring much among themselves, They were making such complaints as that they might have been better employed elsewhere, when after some days there came to us, by the determination of divine mercy, no small consolation. For in the evening 10 Moors entered a skiff beneath the wall and rowed away in the direction of the castle of Palmela. But our men pursued them so closely that they abandoned the skiff in desperation, and everything they were carrying in it. Letters were found in it, directed to several parties and written in the Arabic language. An example of one, as I got it from an interpreter, is as follows. To Abu Muhammad, king of Evora, the unfortunate people of Lisbon, may he maintain his kingdom in safety. What great and terrible and unexpected disasters have come upon us, the desolate ruin of our city, and the great effusion of noble blood. Memorials, alas, of our everlasting grief, proclaim. Already the second moon has almost passed since the fleet of the Franks, which has been borne hither to our borders with the aid of heaven and earth and sea, has kept us shut within the circuit of this close-drawn wall. And what is to be hoped for amid this sum of woes is more than doubtful, except only to look for succor by means of ransom. But with our cooperation, we doubt not that you will liberate the city and the country from the barbarians, for they are not so very numerous or warlike, as their tower and engines, which we have burned with force and arms, bear witness. Otherwise, let your prudence beware, for the same outcome of events and evils awaits you. And the other letters besought the same thing from parents and other relatives and friends, and from debtors. And besides, they besought them to pray for them to Allah, that is God. At the least, he would not permit them at the moment of death to be cheated of that eternal retreat in which his beloved Muhammad dwells in glory. They also gave information concerning their supply of bread and other foodstuffs. When our men learned of these things, their spirits were greatly encouraged to continue the attack against the enemy for some days longer. After a short time, the corpse of a man who had been drowned was found beneath our ships, and on an arm a letter was tied, of which the tenor was as follows. The King of Evora, to the men of Lisbon, liberty of action. Having long since entered into a truce with the King of the Portuguese, I cannot break faith and wage war upon him and his people. For the rest, take heed in good time, buy safety with your money, lest that prove a cause of your hurt, which ought to be a cause of your well-being. Farewell. Give something worthwhile to this our messenger. So finally, as the Moors' last hope of relief was destroyed, our men kept watch the more vigilantly. A part of our army returned from the castle of Sintra, with a great quantity of booty, for the nature of the site prevented them from attempting an assault upon the castle or a siege. While we were carrying on the foregoing operations, the king dismissed all of his own forces, except a small number of knights and the officers of his household, having either sold his provisions or sent them to Santarém. Only the Bishop of Oporto remained constantly with us until the surrender of the city. Meanwhile, the Moors, being hard pressed by hunger, whenever any of their poor were able to do so secretly, they gave themselves up to our men. And so it soon came about that the acts and plans of the enemy could be but little concealed from us. Then our men, attending more strictly to the siege, began to dig a subterranean mine between the tower and the Porta de Ferro, in order that they might bring down the wall. When this had been discovered, for it was quite accessible to the enemy, it proved greatly to our detriment after the investment of the city, for many days were consumed in its vain defense. Besides, 2 Balearic mangonels were set up by our forces, one on the river bank, which was operated by seamen, the other in front of the Porta de Ferro, which was operated by the knights and their table companions, all these men having been divided into groups of 100. On a given signal, the first 100 retired, and another took their places, so that within the space of 10 hours, 5,000 stones were hurled, and the enemy were greatly harassed by this action. Again, the Normans and the English and those who were with them began the erection of a movable tower 83 feet in height. Once more, with a view to bringing down the wall, The men of Cologne and the Flemings began to dig a mine beneath the wall of the stronghold higher up, a mine which, marvelous to relate, had 5 entrances, and extended inside to a depth of 40 cubits from the front, and they completed it within a month. Meanwhile, hunger and the stench of corpses greatly tormented the enemy, for there was no burial space within the city, and for food they collected the refuse, which was thrown out from our ships, and borne up by the waves beneath their walls. A ridiculous incident occurred as a result of their hunger when some of the Flemings, while keeping guard among the ruins of houses, were eating figs, and having had enough, left some lying about unconsumed. When this was discovered by 4 of the Moors, they came up stealthily and cautiously, like birds approaching food. And when the Flemings observed this, they frequently scattered refuse of this sort about, in order that they might lure them on with bait. And finally, having set snares in the accustomed places, they caught 3 of the Moors in them, and thereby caused enormous merriment among us. When the wall had been undermined and inflammable material had been placed within the mine and lighted, the same night at cockcrow, about 30 cubits of the wall crumbled to the ground. Then the Moors who were guarding the wall were heard to cry out in their anguish that they might now make an end of their long labors, and that this very day would be their last, and that it would have to be divided with death, and that this would be their greatest consolation for death, if, without fearing it, they might exchange their lives for ours. For it was necessary to go yonder, whence there was no need of returning, and if a life were well ended, it would nowhere be said to have been cut short. For what mattered was not how long, but how well a life had been lived, and a life would have lasted as long as it should, even though not as long as it naturally could, provided it closed in a fitting end. And so the Moors gathered from all sides for the defense of the breach in the wall, placing against it a barrier of beams. Accordingly, when the men of Cologne and the Flemings went out to attempt an entrance, they were repulsed, for although the wall had collapsed, the nature of the situation on the steep hillside prevented an entry merely by the heap of ruins. But when they failed to overcome the defenders in a hand-to-hand encounter, they attacked them furiously from a distance with arrows, so that they looked like hedgehogs, as bristling with bolts they stood immovably at the defense, and endured as if unharmed. Thus the defense was maintained against the onslaught of the attackers, until the first hour of the day, when the latter retired to camp. The Normans and the English came under arms to take up the struggle in place of their associates, supposing that an entrance would be easy now that the enemy were wounded and exhausted. But they were prevented by the leaders of the Flemings and the men of Cologne, who assailed them with insults and demanded that we attempt an entrance in any way it might be accomplished with our own engines. For they said that they had prepared the breach, which now stood open for themselves, not for us. And so for several days they were altogether repulsed from the breach. So I really like this little episode from the Siege of Lisbon. Of course, ultimately, Lisbon did fall to the Crusaders. So a couple of interesting things. The Muslims at Lisbon received absolutely no help from any other Muslims elsewhere in Iberia, although there were other Muslim principalities nearby. And as we can see here, there's information in the beginning of this excerpt which describes the Muslims sending desperate letters to the King of Evora, for example, who would have been an emir. And he responds saying, no, I cannot help you because I have a truce with the King of Portugal. So this is a common thing. Politics could come before religious concerns on both sides in the Reconquista. Another interesting thing, I think, is I love these primary sources because they really get us into the nitty-gritty feel of what it was like to be there. And one of the big things that comes up throughout this account is food. Apparently the Crusaders had plenty of food throughout the siege, whereas the Muslims within Lisbon were reduced to starvation. Frequently during these long, grueling sieges, the besieged would end up, eating rats and refuse, whatever they could find. And of course, there's this one interesting episode where a group of Muslims attempts to make a grab for some figs that had been left uneaten by some of the Crusaders. And the Crusaders, after that, begin using food as a sort of bait to lure Muslims out of the city and then to capture them once they come out to try to get food. Another interesting thing is that so serious was the starvation that many of the Muslims, in particular the author describes them as poor Muslims within the city, just snuck out of the city and just surrendered to the Crusaders and basically said, look, I'll tell you anything you want to know, just please, spare my life, etc., etc. And, the Crusaders, the author says that the Crusaders were able to learn a lot about what was going on inside of Lisbon just because of that. Another thing that's interesting is we get this dynamic between the different groups of Crusaders. There's some rivalry going on there. For example, the author identifies the men of Cologne and the Flemish. They had made a breach in the wall, and after they assaulted it for a while, they kind of hung back, and then the Normans and English wanted to assault from that side, and the Flemings and the men of Cologne said, no, that's our breach, you can't have it. So, that kind of thing did go on. There was rivalries among groups. And of course, it's interesting too that you see men of the same, location, of the same nationality, attacking together. This was frequently done in medieval warfare just because groups of men from the same region often, they grew up together, they had trained together, they had similar fighting style, and so they were better able to coordinate. I think we have to also look at how stoutly and firmly the Muslims of Lisbon resisted this attack. They really did fight pretty valiantly. This part where the breach is made by the men of Cologne and the Flemings, they're not able to cross through that breach, despite the fact that they've made it, at least not at first. The Muslims just hold that position. And there's even a part where it says, they start to look like porcupines or hedgehogs full of arrows, because at first they try to direct assault, and then if that didn't work, so they hung back and they just started launching arrows. It's interesting, too, we see how these different tactics worked with medieval warfare. Sometimes it was trial and error, but there was always different avenues available to try to do this. And it wasn't a matter of just like, I feel like in movies oftentimes we get the sense that it's just like, tons of guys just go running at a city and that's how a siege happened, which of course is not true. I mean, it was a slow process, involved a lot of maneuvers and strategy. Another interesting issue is mining. Mining takes precedent in this account because obviously that was one of the most important ways that besiegers could undermine a city. And we see here the author talks about how much effort was spent in digging these mines and what a disaster it was when the Muslims would discover that mine, because all that effort, all that digging was suddenly, would go to waste. And finally, I want to point out that part towards the end of the account where the author places in the mouths of the Muslim defenders this kind of heroic, resignation to their fate and their commitment to just fight to the death, and how that will ultimately amount to a life well lived. Yes, you're about to be destroyed by these besiegers. However, to fight to the death, to be brave to the end, that is noteworthy. That is commendable. And he's putting this in the mouths of his enemies, Muslim infidel enemies at that. I think that's kind of interesting. It's not uncommon, really, in medieval writings to see Christian authors kind of putting sort of a sense of respect for the valor and the fighting capabilities of Muslims into their work. He doesn't say, and then we really just came in for the kill on these filthy scumbucket Muslims. No, he really kind of writes about them in a rather respectful way. It's interesting. And of course, we do find medieval authors who, refer to their Muslim enemies as, vile pigs or something like that. But, there is a variety of attitudes. Now, one disadvantage for King Afonso in employing foreign crusaders within his army was that he was not fully able to control them. They were a benefit in terms of their numbers, but he didn't have full control over them. An example of this is that Afonso promised the Muslims of Lisbon that they could leave the city with their lives if they didn't try to take any possessions with them. However, we know that some Muslims were killed as they were leaving the city. And this was done by some of the foreign crusaders. So he wasn't fully able to keep his promise as a sovereign. And this was a very important thing to medieval kings. They really wanted to be able to, when they gave a safe conduct, they wanted it to be respected. And they would usually punish any violation of their safe conduct by their own subjects with a brutal response, because it was just looked bad for a medieval king to not be able to keep his word in that way. But the problem here is, how does he juggle that in terms of he's employing crusaders who are not a part of his kingdom in his army? How much authority does he really have over them? So a great little account of a pivotal moment in the history of Portugal and the career of King Afonso I. You can find this account in a book called Medieval Iberia, Readings from Christian, Muslim, and Jewish Sources, edited by Olivia Ramey Constable. I will put information about that in the About box. Thanks very much for being with me today. Do go to realcrusadeshistory.com to check out our website. Also, if you like Real Crusades History and want to support us, please make a PayPal donation using the PayPal link in the About box. Thank you.